The Taliban has intensified its military offensive across Afghanistan as President Biden looks to end America's longest war, potentially in the near future. He is reviewing the Trump administration's 2020 peace deal that calls for U.S. troops to leave the war-torn country by May 1st. However, a surge in violence and deadly attacks have forced officials to rethink their strategy, fearing a total withdrawal will trigger more bloodshed between Afghans and militants. NATO officials are meeting this week to discuss the next steps.
The Taliban must reduce violence, negotiate in good faith, and live up to their commitment to stop cooperating with international terrorist groups. Our common goal is clear. Afghanistan should never again serve as a haven for terrorists to attack our homelands. So our presence is conditions-based. While no ally wants to stay in Afghanistan longer than necessary, we will not leave before the time is right.
Well, NATO and the U.S. are urging the Taliban to honor its side of the agreement by implementing ceasefires and cutting ties with al-Qaeda militants. The Pentagon says despite all of this, President Biden is still pushing for a political solution.
I don't want to speak for the president, but I think he's been very consistent about when he talks about ending forever wars, that certainly includes Afghanistan. And he's also many times talked about doing it in a responsible way and through a political settlement. So I think there's no question of where the commander-in-chief sits on what needs to happen long-term in Afghanistan.
All right, so for more on this, let's bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata to talk about all this. So, Charlie, explain to our viewers what's at stake in Afghanistan if the United States decides to either fully withdraw troops or if the decision is made to leave some forces there on the ground.
Well, Vlad, everything's at stake. Afghanistan has been messy, and it's never messier than it is right now because there are no easy options. This agreement brokered with President Trump about a year ago, February last year, was that all these troops, 2,500 U.S. troops, the rest of them would be withdrawn. Thousands have been withdrawn, even in the past couple of months. And, of course, that's going to precipitate the withdrawal of NATO forces. What's at stake here? Well, I have to read this quote, and this came from General Joe Dunsford, who I've interviewed several times. He spent years in Afghanistan, and he's now advising the administration. He's chairing this group, and they came to this chilling conclusion. Withdrawal in May under current conditions will likely lead to a collapse of the Afghan state and a possible renewed civil war. In addition to, and this is important because this is one of the qualifiers for any agreement with the Taliban, a reconstitution of the terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland within 18 months to 3 years.
Yeah, that is concerning. Charlie, here's the thing. The Taliban continues to seize territory across the country, despite the U.S. peace deal and these ongoing talks with the Afghan government. Why are they participating in the peace process if they're sort of disregarding it as it's going along? Or is there a disconnect between the members of the Taliban that are negotiating in these plush boardrooms or whatever, and members of the Taliban that are out in the country actually sort of engaging in various conflicts?
Anne-Marie, there's an element of that. Exactly, there's an element of that. When you say you negotiate with the Taliban, there are several different disparate, some gang-related, some criminal-related organizations. Some of them are vehemently anti-U.S. and would never agree to some of the agreements that have been agreed to in places like Doha, specifically with the agreement with the Trump administration. So yes, when you say, has there been an agreement brokered with the Taliban, there are different splinter groups. But what we're seeing here is absolute Taliban tactics. They realize, they know that May 1st is when all U.S. troops are going to be pulling out. The sort of loose agreement was they're not going to shoot at U.S. troops on the way out. That's about the only thing that they've adhered to. They haven't really engaged with American forces. But yes, there's been this incredible land grab. And I have to point out, we're in the middle of the winter, right, in parts of Afghanistan. They've even come to parts of like Kunduz, which is north of Kabul. And what that does is sever choke points and supply routes into Kabul itself. So they have done a land grab in the south around Kandahar. That's always going forward. You will hear that people will say that parts of these areas are Taliban controlled. They are specifically Taliban controlled, but it also means that they have freedom of movement in these areas. Essentially, the Afghan forces have pulled back in order to have the Taliban control that, in order to avoid fighting. And certainly U.S. forces have disengaged in those territories in the south. What's really concerning here is they're starting to push towards some of these cities in a place that the fighting season, as we know that phrase, that usually happens in the summertime. So what they're doing, this is tactical. Taliban know exactly what they're doing. They're going after these cities. They're hitting the Afghan forces as hard as they possibly can because they know people are going to be making decisions. The Biden administration is going to be making decisions. NATO is going to be making decisions over the next few weeks and months as to whether that they are going to continue to have a troop presence in that country. And as ever, as these key periods come up, that's when the Taliban make their move. So they are in a position, if there is going to be negotiation, a position of power. It gives them leverage, simply.
So, Charlie, how are the Afghans reacting to all of this? I mean, is there a sense that Taliban control brings some sort of stability to some of the more rural conservative areas as opposed to the bigger cities where activists, of course, fear specifically that there will be a rollback of basic human freedoms and specifically as it relates to women?
Well, that is a key question, Vlad. In the parts of the South, yes. Okay, you have to define what stability means. And to the poor people of Afghanistan and some of these war-torn, I hate that phrase, war-torn areas, but it is a war-torn area, just not a cease to the fighting would be enough. The Taliban have taken control of some of these areas. They have said that, yes, part of the agreement is that women can go to school and women can go to university and women can hold jobs, but they're not really being taught the kind of university or school or education that we in the West would appreciate or understand. So they're sort of reneging on that. And yes, there are deep concerns. Human Rights Watch have said that this is going to take any of the progress, specifically with women in Afghanistan, back decades to when the Taliban were under control. The Taliban, even in negotiating in Doha, they tried to sort of give this gloss of Taliban 2.0, like more enlightened, more open to negotiation. But at their hearts, they are fundamentalists. And here's a very key component of this. At no point did they ever said that they were going to, make peace, as it were, or even a reasonable peace with the Afghan government. They want a power sharing agreement with the Afghan government with President Ghani. That's just not going to happen. They've asked for 7,000 prisoners to be released. That's just not going to happen. Those negotiations haven't even taken place. So yes, the Taliban is controlling areas. You may say that they're stable simply because not as many people are dying because there's less fighting. But in those Taliban-controlled areas, it wouldn't be described as freedom as you or I or the Biden administration or NATO would ever consider it.
So looking ahead, Charlie, next week, NATO defense ministers are going to be speaking with President Biden, rather speaking with the Biden administration. They're going to be reviewing this Taliban peace deal. What are you going to be looking out for?
Listen, Emery, the big problem here is there are a few options and all of them are messy. Okay, so let's take option one, which is to ask you what I'd be looking out for. I imagine that NATO is going to put pressure on the Biden administration to find some way to extend this deadline, this May 1st deadline. Even though it's 2,500 troops, they have overwatch from the United States. There are between 8,000 and 10,000 NATO forces there as well. But let's face it, the United States is the driving force. They have the overwatch. They have the air power. They have the surveillance. They have the intelligence. I imagine that NATO is going to be pushing the Biden administration to at least try to extend this deadline. If that happens, we're going to open the door to Taliban attacks. The Taliban have tried to keep their attacks to Afghan forces. They will start going after U.S. forces, and they'll start going after NATO forces. That's not great. If the United States continues and says, okay, we're going to honor that agreement, even though the Taliban have not, and we will turn up May 1st. Again, is that going to collapse? The Taliban will see that as a victory anyway, as soon as they see foreign forces leave, and it may lead to a collapse and a civil war. The other thing is to do nothing. And if that's the case, then we are looking at just a few weeks. I mean, May 1st isn't that far away, where the Taliban will be looking at the clock and saying, we are going to make our move. So my hunch is that NATO is going to put some pressure on the Biden administration that may give the Biden administration an out saying, look, this isn't United States driven now. NATO and the United States have both agreed that if we pull forces out now, it is going to lead to an instability in Afghanistan that nobody wants to stomach.
All right. Charlie D'Agata, always great to have you break this down for us, Charlie. As always, we appreciate it. Thank you, my friend.